Hello, everyone. My name is Sandra Collins, and I'm the Director of the National Library of Ireland. And it's my great honour to welcome you all this evening to our online event in our Living with Pride programme. Living with Pride is a flagship project for the National Library this year. It represents a commitment to diversity and inclusion, and specifically to LGBTI+ equality. We hope that through this project, we can raise awareness of the Irish Queer Archive and the LGBTI+ collections, which we care for in the NLI, including the Christopher Robson Photographic collection, the Marriage Equality campaign papers, the Born Digital Marriage Equality Photographic Archive, and many more. These collections form part of the memory of Ireland, and it is an honour to hold them in trust and to find ways to explore and promote them, and to encourage people to engage with and to be inspired by them. There are a number of elements to Living with Pride. Today is the 7th panel discussion in the Living with Pride year-long programme of events. This programme is co-curated by Tonie Walsh, and it's ambitious and wide-ranging, from drag story time to workshops, hands-on workshops in the IQA, to discussions about activism, representation and identity. And I'd really like to thank Tonie for the vision he's brought to the programme. We also have the Living with Pride exhibition. This is an exhibition of the Christopher Robson Photographic collection, which contains over 2,000 slides, mostly taken at Pride events in Ireland between 1992 up to 2007. This collection was donated to us by Christopher's partner, Bill Foley, and Bill has co-curated the exhibition with us. The photographs are all fully digitised and available for you to view and explore in our online catalogue. And the exhibition is running now in the National Library's Photographic archive in Temple Bar, and it's open 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And if you haven't had a chance to pop in yet, I really invite you and recommend it to you. The exhibition is also fully digitised, so that if you can't visit us in person, you can visit us online and enjoy the exhibition wherever in the world you are. In Living with Pride, we're also partnering with the Curt International Festival of Literature, and that gives us Sean Hewitt as our first poet in residence based at the Irish Queer Archive. And Sean is exploring and sharing stories from the IQA through his poetry. Overall, our approach to developing Living with Pride has been guided by the principle of nothing about us without us. And I'm hugely grateful to our co-curators and our partners, and to Shout Out, who provided training for our teams. I also want to thank the great staff of the National Library who have been and continue to be working hard on this programme. We also recognise that there's more work for us to do in our diversity and inclusion programme, and that's something we're going to be continuing to work on in the coming years. But now, for tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce our chair for this evening, Brian Crowley. Brian is the collections curator for 2 OPW-run museums, Kilmainham Jail Museum and the Pearse Museum. He is the former chair of the Irish Museums Association and the author of Patrick Pearse, A Life in Pictures. Most recently, his article, Queering Kilmainham, Uncovering LGBTQIA+ Stories in a National Shrine, was published in the 2020 edition of Studia Hibernica. Hand over to you now, Brian. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sandra. And thank you also for inviting me along this evening to kind of get in the mood and the right frame of mind to actually hop back in to see Living with Pride this week. I saw it when it was first launched, but I went back in again this week. And again, just to commend you on such a wonderful life-enhancing exhibition. And I think particularly at the moment, it feels just the kind of exhibition we need right now, because it's a real kind of celebration of life in all its messy fabulousness, and made me very excited about getting back to some kind of normality. Not that there's anything particularly normal about Pride celebrations, and that's, I think, why we love them. So I am delighted to be introducing our panel this evening, and I'm just going to introduce them as they appear on my screen. Our first panelist is Dr. Páraic Kerrigan, who is the Assistant Professor at the School of Information and Communication Studies at UCD. His research pertains to the dynamics of diversity in the media industry and its production cultures, specifically centred on Ireland's LGBT community, along with a focus on digital media cultures and platform governance. He has just released his first book, LGBTQ, Visibility, Media and Sexuality in Ireland, and has written over 10 articles and book chapters pertaining to Irish culture. Our next speaker is Kate Drinane, who has been part of the education of Ireland for 9 years. She introduced and developed LGBTQIA+ programming at the gallery, including the management of Outing the Past Festival of LGBT History. She most recently co-curated Queer Mind, Body and Soul, an exhibition of artworks created and curated by a group of LGBTQIA+ gender non-conforming young people and their allies. If you haven't seen it, do go in and see it. I saw it myself a few weeks ago, and again, it's just brilliant. Kate is also the co-founder of Queer Culture Ireland, and she is the queer queen of the National Gallery of Ireland. Our final speaker on the panel this evening is Deirdre Swain, who is from Cork and has been working as a librarian since 2007, and has been working in public libraries for the last 5.5 years. She's an LGBT activist and curated an exhibition in the library on the 1969 Stonewall Riots and on Stormé de Laverie, an important character in this pivotal event, i.e. Stonewall. And she's currently working on researching the life of Stormé de Laverie in order to write a book about her. She also arranged an exhibition to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the legalisation of same-sex marriage in Ireland in 2020. But I was talking to Deirdre yesterday, and like so many things that we did in 2020, it had to be postponed. But hopefully, again, as things start to open up again, this exhibition will be going on display. And one of the things as well that I was talking to Deirdre about as well is that she has been involved in setting up an LGBT book club, which sounds very, very exciting. So just, I suppose, to kick things off, I'm just going to go around the panel and just ask you, each member of the panel, to talk a little bit about their work around kind of LGBT visibility, and also the thing I'm always really fascinated is kind of the thing that kind of first drew them to this area. So if I could start with you, Páraic, just because you're beside me on the screen. What kind of, if you could just talk a little bit about your research, but also kind of what led you to this subject area.
Yeah, so I'll start with perhaps how I actually got to the research and what made me interested in this. And believe it or not, it all stems back to Coronation Street. And how does this extend back to Coronation Street, you ask? Well, one of the kind of the first instances when I recall any kind of queer visibility being in the media whatsoever was the hysteria that emerged in the Irish media and the British media around Coronation Street's first gay kiss with Todd Grimshaw. So I kind of said to myself, as I was doing my master's, I kind of went, where were the Irish queers in the media? Because I don't necessarily remember seeing myself reflected back to me on Irish screens, particularly on the likes of RTE cultural productions in Irish cinema. And I kind of wanted to know where we were in the archives, where we were on screen, where we were in terms of representation. So from that, I was kind of entered into a wonderland of sorts where I was chasing this white rabbit. And this is kind of something that we often see in terms of representation in queer history, that we kind of have to forage. We kind of need to go searching for the truffles that do exist, but are buried And they're buried because of institutional invisibility that's been conferred onto the communities, but also by the lack of respect that's been given to queer histories and queer narratives. So that's kind of where I began garnering this interest in LGBTQ visibility and representation in Ireland. And it's from there that I one day got into the RTE archives just to have a look around and see what was actually there. And I stumbled upon a plethora of materials that was actually there, but just wasn't necessarily documented in terms of formal historical narratives or analysis. So that actually served as the basis for what became my PhD, which was examining how queer Irish identities were conveyed in Irish public media over the course of a 40-year period, from the foundation of an Irish gay civil rights movement in 1974, and looking how visibility itself, representation, became a very important arm of the activism and the fight for Irish gay civil rights during this period. So that's kind of what brought me to that research, and that kind of formed the foundation of my first book, which tells the story of it wasn't just a fight for decriminalisation, for broader liberation, for legal changes and policy changes, but it was actually a fight for visibility, to shift minds, attitudes, and to get Middle Ireland, as it's so often referred to acknowledge that gay people and LGBT people more broadly aren't actually that bad. So that's kind of where I came upon this and how I came to this research.
If I just move on to you, Deirdre, and hopefully we'll sort out the issue with Kim. So I suppose, again, just if you could talk a little bit of the work that you've done and I suppose what drew you to it.
Well, I've always been, especially since the marriage referendum, I canvassed in the marriage referendum, and it was one of the best experiences of my life. And I was on a working group. Well, I am on a working group in the library. I'm working in a public library in Cork. I'm on a working group that does exhibitions on Irish history, on the revolutionary period of Irish history, so 1913 to 1923. So I was always, thinking of what anniversary is coming up, of 50 years or 100 years or, 1916. It'll be it was the War of Independence. It'll be the Civil War now, soon. So I was used to thinking of, commemorating different anniversaries. And I had actually never heard of the Stonewall Riots, would you believe? But then my girlfriend at the time was telling me all about it. And then in 2018, I went to New York, and I actually went to the Stonewall Inn. And it was amazing. And I really wanted to, in 2019, I really wanted to do an exhibition on it, but I was a bit nervous because I wasn't out in work at the time. But I said I couldn't let this opportunity go by of 50 years, the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. So I decided to do an exhibition on it. So I did an exhibition on the Stonewall Riots. And when I was doing my research for the exhibition, I came across in a short book just on the basics of, LGBT civil rights and the civil rights movement and everything. I came across Stormé de Larverie, and I thought, she looks interesting. And, it said that she was the first person to start the Stonewall Riots. And I said, well, if she's the first person, then it'll be easy to find information on her. And I said, I kind of made a mental note. I must look up more information on her. But the exhibition wasn't mainly about her. It was about the whole thing. But then I started doing more research on her, and I found out it was extremely difficult to find any information on her at all. I mean, if you Google her on the internet, she comes up as she was the one who threw the first punch in Stonewall. But it's very hard to find there'd be a line here, a page here, a chapter here in very out of print books that I have to order from America. I was lucky, I found a whole chapter on her, a about the hotel she lived in, actually, towards the end of her life, and someone who knew her there. But it's very difficult to find information on her. Now, she does have an archive. Her archive is in New York Public Library, which I also visited. And I got to see her passport and everything. But it's there's very limited information. For example, I couldn't find out even what the name of her mother or father was, or her girlfriend who died slightly after the Stonewall Riots. I couldn't find any of that kind of information out. But so anyway, that was my first LGBT exhibition. But then I decided, because my senior colleague was actually a great LGBT ally and very supportive. So I decided then that every year during either during LGBT Awareness Week, which is in May usually in Cork, or else during Pride, which is around is it June or August, every year, that I do an LGBT exhibition. And as you mentioned, Brian, in 2020, I wanted to do one on the marriage equality referendum, because I thought 5 years is a good anniversary. But unfortunately, it hasn't happened yet. But hopefully next year for the 7th anniversary.
Yeah, well, no, you can call it the 7-year itch. And but as I said, so many of us, I think, have been working on things that have been postponed, or where titles have been changed to celebrate maybe an extra year in terms of anniversaries. So, Kate, for the first time, you were slightly behind with me, because you're usually way ahead. You were talking about like how you got started with the, I suppose initially I think it was the tours of the gallery collection.
Yeah, it was like, I've been working in the gallery for a good few years, and a teachers group got in touch, an LGBT teachers group got in touch, and they asked if we could do an LGBT tour of the gallery. And I was basically just waiting for an excuse to legitimately make it part of my job. And this was a perfect excuse. So started the research. They very kindly were my guinea pigs, and I was so nervous, and they were so kind. And then I started rolling out the tour as a public tour, which then grew into talks, which then grew into out in the past, which then just sort of kept snowballing. I say it kept snowballing, that makes it sound like there wasn't a plan. There actually is a 5-year plan. And I'm on track, which is nice. But it slowly grew. And what was great was that it grew not only from people inside the gallery that helped, because it turned out that actually loads of people had been doing little snippets of research and not really knowing where to put it. So when I started creating the tour and then the online content and the talks and the events, loads of my colleagues started coming out of the woodwork and going, oh, hey, I found this bit of research. Would you like it? Which is great. But also what happened was I started every single tour with a notebook in my hand. And normally I don't do that, because if you've already probably guessed, I gesture a lot when I'm talking, and I don't tend to hold things because they're liable to fly out of my hand. But I kept a tight grip on this notebook, and throughout all of the first year of the tours, I would take notes, feedback from the community, anyone who was on the tour. And therefore, all the research was shaped by the community, which meant the world to me. And I sort of pulled all that together over time into what is now the Through a Lens LGBT tour on the gallery's website. So it's 10 artworks that people can view and walk around the gallery and look at, except there's one that isn't up. Unfortunately, it's a work on paper. But that has been a huge amount of fun. And then while I was also doing that research, Brian, you've heard me say this before, I realized that while I was working with my colleagues in the gallery and the community, a huge amount of the research and finding out about our community's history comes from the people themselves and comes from each other. And what I really wanted to do was bring everyone together. And it struck me, I think, at the first Out in the Past that I spoke at, which was in Belfast, that all the speakers went for dinner beforehand, and it was just so good for the soul. Like, we were all talking about our research and how it was hard and how it was great, and all the just the nitty gritty of it. And it was brilliant. It was soothing. And I basically wanted to do that again and again and again and again. So myself and Judith Finlay, who actually met at that Out in the Past, we started Queer Culture Ireland as a way to bring people together to help with research, but also now to help with a load more things. So we kind of connect people to each other and help people out and big people up, I guess. That's kind of the plan. But the main thing, I think, is that all of the research I do and the way it's steered is from the community kind of at all times, which I love. Any excuse to hang out with my people.
So one of the things, like Deirdre, you mentioned it in terms of like the problem of lack of sources, and Kate, you also mentioned that researching in queer history can be kind of challenging again because of, I suppose, all the silences. And I know in terms of the stuff I've done in Kilmainham around its queer history, there's a degree of speculation, which especially at first I was a little uncomfortable with. So I was just going to ask you, Páraic, as well. You kind of mentioned again, kind of what are the challenges around researching in this area? Because I think there's particular issues around queer history that you may not get in when it comes to studying kind of other groups.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, some of the challenges that can emerge in queer histories and in representation more broadly, kind of, so what my research tends to do is look at representation and how that might intersect with media representations. And kind of one concern that I would generally always have would be that, while visibility can empower, while visibility can reveal, visibility also is two sides of one coin, right? So with that, although visibility might empower your community to at least show the liberal agenda of the LGBT community, it also can subject them to further surveillance. And at points, members of a particular community can become devolved to being subjects of debates. And in particular, we're seeing this quite often happening with our trans brothers and sisters quite a lot at the moment, where they're becoming dehumanized to the point of being a talking point or a conceptual problem even. An issue that's discussed and debated endlessly. And that's an example of the ways in which representational issues and discursive strategies can actually emerge and can actually affect communities. And as a result of these media representations, have very real life effects on that community. And it kind of just reflects the fact that, there's a responsibility with representation as well, in that there should be some sort of universal agreement that identities and rights should not be up for debate and should not be subjected to representational narratives of debate that we are beginning to see in the media. And this, in queer history and in the archives, in the IQA, you can see that with gay men in the 70s and the 80s. And I would like to say that you could see it with lesbians, but that was to a far lesser extent, because if lesbians were even lucky to get the privilege of any kind of visibility, because it seemed like the media institution of Ireland throughout the 70s and 80s was only interested in the gay male experience. And there's varying different reasons for that. Sure, we can say that criminalisation of gay sex between men might be partly to do with that. But there's a lot to be said for the fact that many of the movements were dominated by men. And in some instances, there was a lot of misogyny in the LGBT community during the 70s and 80s as well. So representationally, issues can emerge and we need to be acute and aware of them. In the histories themselves, we need to obviously be aware of the gaps that can be there, why those gaps are there in doing these queer histories. And oftentimes, queer history itself can be quite queer in that it's fragmented. And one must be aware when doing queer history that we're doing history queerly. It's not going to be in neat packages, but it's going to be coming through fractures and fragments, particularly the archive. The archive for queer people is very ephemeral. Much of our history is either in legal criminal records or it's been destroyed. So we need to develop strategies of intergenerational collaboration to develop oral histories, to find pieces of where we are. So, and I'm sure any of you who has kind of done an exhibition is fully aware of that. So, to answer your question, Brian, I think those are some of the representational issues that can emerge, but also some of the issues that can emerge when we're looking at researching queer Irish history and queer histories more broadly.
And Deirdre, would you because I know that in terms of I suppose you touched on it there with the Stormy the Library. Do you think there's a particular issue around kind of queer women's history in terms of that kind of that silences and those gaps?
I do, and when Páraic was talking there, it just occurred to me when Queen Victoria in England criminalised homosexuality, she criminalised male homosexuality, but she didn't criminalise lesbianism. Why? Because she didn't believe that women loved women. So therefore, she didn't criminalise it because she said it didn't exist. And that brings me on to, well, a lot of lesbians are, well, at least Stormé de Larverie, she's become invisible. She's been erased from history. And why is this? Well, obviously she was lesbian, but she was also female. She was she wasn't black, she was biracial, so which made life even harder for her than if she had been black. Her father was white and her mother was black, so she was biracial. She wasn't transsexual, but she was androgynous. She was often mistaken for a man. So she belonged to a lot of minorities, and I think because of that, and particularly because she was female and lesbian, for some reason people don't like to acknowledge that. And it's just really difficult to find any information on her. And as I say, she has an archive in New York, but a lot of the archive is just maybe cards that were sent to her or books that she had when she died and things like that don't give me any information on her. And I also find another challenge is, and I find this when I'm, dealing with the book club, the LGBT book club that I'm in, that a lot of LGBT literature has a very short print run, and it's really hard to get in mainstream, like even Vibes and Scribes, and they're, in Cork, that like they have an LGBT section, but even there, like I often have to order any kind of LGBT nonfiction or fiction from America or somewhere because it's just really hard to get. So that's a big challenge as well.
And Kate, I know, like, again, particularly in relation to queer women, that's been kind of an issue with some of your research. And I think we've discussed my theory that you should be able to footnote your gaydar on occasion, because in some ways, certainly in terms of the stuff we've done in Kilmainham and looking at revolutionary women involved in the revolutionary movement in Ireland, it was very easy to kind of hide in plain sight. I suppose, could you maybe talk a little bit about how you've dealt with that in terms of the realm of art?
Yeah, I think in the realm of art, it's always a little easier as well because part of my title is the word interpretation. So I get to interpret the collection, which is a gift and a whole lot of fun. So I'm lucky in that, I work with art, and a lot of what you do with art is interpret it, which is nice. But yeah, when it comes to representation, say, for example, the most recent bit of the Through a Lens research that's on the gallery's website, everything we do in the gallery, we use the LGBTQIA+ acronym, which was sort of a gallery-wide policy we decided really early on. And I wanted, particularly with that one, where I have set 10 works for each one of those, that I wanted to get every acronym, or every letter of the acronym. That is not the easiest thing to do when you're looking at a historical collection. And in some cases, it feels a little bit crowbarred in, and to some extent it is. Like I'm the first one to throw my hands up with that, and I think I even say it in the intro to it. But I felt that highlighting those parts of the community, even if it does seem kind of tenuous, was better than not representing them at all. So it's not always the easiest. And of course, when you're talking about asexual representation and intersex representation, that's particularly difficult with a historical collection like ours. Like the asexual one is you're almost trying to prove the absence of something historically that nobody really knew that they identified, or hardly anyone knew, like identified as it, as asexual or aromantic. up until relatively recently, the last, say, 30 or 40 years. But so there's a lot of sort of questioning more than proving, which I feel very comfortable with as an art historian and a queer art historian. But then I get to work with art so that you can question things rather than having to 100% prove things. But that has been a debate inside the gallery, and obviously everything that I put on the website I run past all the curators as well, and we've had some great discussions about it, which has been really interesting. But I feel like even asking the question is enough, and then say the queer representation as well, a lot of it is just asking the question, you know, why are we assuming everyone was straight in the past, because that is not the case by any shape of the imagination. I mean, also I'm using contemporary language for historical collection, which comes up with its own kettle of fish and problems and issues, and I'm very much aware of that. But it is, I think, still worth doing, even if I do get in trouble for it. But yeah, there are definitely problems when it comes to representation looking historically, but it is, yeah, still definitely worth it. And I love footnoting my gaydar, even if it's just verbally as opposed to on an actual official document.
Yeah, because one of the things actually that Páraic brought up, and I'd be interested to see your own response to this, is, you know, the degree of transphobia, particularly, that's out there at the moment, and we have some items connected with like trans people in the Kilmainham collection. I've actually been kind of reluctant, because it's related to a living person, to even mention it on something like Twitter or Facebook, just because the idea of bringing that level of kind of vitriol onto somebody who might come across it, or for trans people to be exposed, you know, and, you know, they don't. So I feel trans people are being exposed to it all the time, no matter what. But, you know, it feels that even mentioning the word now on social media will cause this kind of avalanche of awful hate. And I've been kind of interested in terms of the fact that I'm kind of almost surprised that I've been kind of slightly cowed by it. But I don't know if you've come across the same thing, that kind of concern over that particular area.
Yeah, I think in terms of like the work I've done in the gallery, it's more concern around putting labels on people that would not have been familiar with those labels, I guess, in our case, and just not necessarily the concern, but just the applying of those labels, because our collection is looking at obviously people from the 1700s, 1800s, particularly the examples that we have. But I think there's still value to highlighting their lives. And also there's a couple, like in various different parts of the community historically, what you end up looking for is the people that were outed, which is also a very uncomfortable place to be as a member of the community. You're kind of, and like a colleague, a heterosexual colleague asked me when I was talking about one particular artist, just conversationally, like we were chatting about it, and she said, yeah, but are you not, like, this artist in particular, specifically when they were alive, kept their sexual life very, very private. And it was only after they died that their homosexuality came to light. And she was asking, are you actually outing somebody then? Which is an excellent question. Or are you then hammering down on the fact that they were outed, which is also an excellent question. So I think there's definitely levels to it. And I think, yeah, Brian, I know the example that you're talking about in Kilmainham, and it's a really tricky situation, I think. I think just, take each case as it comes. It's kind of, it's a minefield. But I think there's value to the representation when it's possible, I think, to prove that the trans community has always been here historically. I think that adds a great weight kind of against that stupid, it's just a fad nonsense that, the other side tout. So I think there's value to it.
Yeah. Is it, like, for myself, one of the things I've kind of decided is it's probably better for me to do trans representation actually in the museum and in this, in our events and the things that we do, and not on social media, because to a certain extent I feel in the museum, they're on my turf, and I know how to deal with that, but I just think social media for trans people at the moment it's just a cesspit. I'm afraid. But I suppose on a slightly more positive note, Páraic, I was at one of the previews for Philly McMahon's Once Before I Go in the Gate, which is this kind of play about kind of queer lives in Ireland in the 80s and 90s and today. And there's a moment in it involving the appearance of, sorry, God, I've forgotten his name now. That's terrible. At a senior moment. But it was a Late Late Show when the priest from New York, Father Bernard
Lynch.
Yeah, sorry, senior moment. I'm blaming COVID and old age. Sorry, Bernard Lynch. So there's a moment where he comes on the telly and everything stops and they look at this interview, and you can feel that it's a really important moment, not just because of what he's saying, but because it's on the Late Late Show, kind of the national conversation. So I was just wondering, just in terms of your own work, like, how important were moments like that for queer people, and how important was it for kind of overt discussions of kind of queer lives on the media in Ireland?
Absolutely. And I mean, it can't be denied that representation really did play a crucial role. And representation is a particularly acute issue for any minority, but in particular LGBT communities, because it can shape how the community is viewed by society, but also, and more importantly, how the community actually sees themselves. So what this did, and particularly throughout, queer visibility in Ireland, in the case of Father Bernard Lynch back in 1988, it was, it provides an opportunity and a platform for LGBT people to disentangle themselves from generic stereotypes. And in particular, throughout the 70s and 80s, they were configured in the likes of the Red Top, such as the Sun and the Mirror, as trench coat wearing paedophiles. And this is like the recirculated narrative consistently. But this television platform, as it began to emerge and become popularized and became the most popular media platform in Ireland up until the early 2000s, provided the LGBT community a platform to disentangle themselves. It also made available to isolated LGBTQ people an awareness of shared existences and desires. And in particular, I want to call out the appearance of Joni Crone on The Late Late Show in 1980. That appearance by Joni as the first out self-declared lesbian on national television was really crucial. And I spoke to Joni when I was writing my book, and she kind of noted to me how even to this day, people come up to her and said, your interview on that show at that time, while I was kind of, watching from my bedroom or watching awkwardly beside my parents on the couch, knowing that I was a young lesbian but could never really come out in this Ireland, that really saved me. And I knew that there was a community for me. If I just waited until I was 18, I could go to Dublin and live a full life. So there's something really powerful in that it provides just a simple indexical sign that queer people exist and they're out there and that there is a community for them. And that's really, really crucial. And one other example that came from my research that really demonstrates this is Fair City. So, prior to the watershed, and I say that in inverted commas, gay kiss, or the near gay kiss in 1996, which didn't happen. And that's a different story, and we can get into that another time. But Owen Healy was the character that came into the show, and he came back in as dubbed by the tabloids in a New Year's Twist. Gay character comes out in New Year's Twist. So he came out to Niamh Cassidy on the New Year's special, and this was meant to be the cliffhanger and the conclusion to the episode. But crucially, what happened after the episode aired was that the calls to gay switchboards around the country in each province quadrupled. So the fact that this young gay man coming out on this primetime soap opera, which had quite a large amount of viewers in the 90s, bear in mind, had really huge ramifications for the community. And people actively sought out helplines to, I suppose, help them find out more information about their identity or see what services or communities were available for them. So while we're talking about, how visibility can confer more surveillance onto communities and how visibility can commit atrocities to communities in some respects, it does have these ramifications as well. It can make LGBT people feel less isolated. It can make them feel part of a community. And it can actually just show them that there is a community there for them. And in a lot of instances, it saved people's lives. So representation cannot be understated. And there's many more examples beyond the Fair City one, beyond Joni Crone that I've referenced. David Norris's first appearance on Last House in 1975 with Anya O'Connor sent a deluge of letters that are in the Irish Queer Archive to the Irish gay rights movement at the time, showing that people really needed this resource, and visibility, representation in the media gave it to them.
It's incredible how important representation is. And actually, I'm just cutting in there. The exhibition that we have on at the moment, the LGBT, the Queer Mind, Body and Soul exhibition that we have, it's LGBT young people. They're 15 to 20 years old. They're incredible. I met with them earlier. And one of them, I won't name who, but one of them wanted to use their artwork to come out to their parents. And they they decided they weren't going to do it, and they were thinking about it. But they told us this evening in a workshop that they'd done it, and their parents are like super duper supportive. But how cool is it that they get to come out through the National Gallery? Like they use their artwork as a way of coming out. I'm in awe of how cool and totally badass that is. But it's the fact that they get to like have this sense of comfort in owning a space that is theirs. And I think that's the same across all culture and all medias. If you give the community a space, there's like a sense of ownership of it, which is it's one of my favorite things to witness happen. I love it.
Absolutely. I mean, art and culture and media really do demonstrate how it can just be that lightning or that prod that creates that conversation and serves as the conduit for those young queer people that you're describing, Kate, to have those conversations. So, I mean, it just again underpins the importance of representation.
And sorry, I'm back. Deirdre, in terms of like the work that you've done, one of the things I'm particularly interested in is actually the book club, because I think it feels a very kind of social space to bring and give them kind of maybe time to discuss issues and kind of tease them out. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit just about that and how you go about as well finding the books to discuss.
Yeah, there are actually two book clubs. So I set up a book club in Link in Cork. So it's a community organisation for lesbian and bisexual women in Cork. And I set up a book club there. So it happens once a month, every month. On the first Friday, we have our book club tomorrow, actually, evening. And how do we choose the books for that? Well, they have to be lesbian or bisexual. The characters or the writers of the characters in them or the writers of them have to be either lesbian or bisexual women. But that's all. We take suggestions from members of the book club, and I don't run it anymore. But I ran it for nearly 3 years. So, but it's been taken over now. I just got caught up with a lot of things, so I don't run it anymore. But so we take suggestions from the other members, and also we give suggestions ourselves. And then there's also an LGBT book club in the library that I didn't actually set it up. It was my senior colleague, but it was great. It was around the same time as the Stonewall exhibition. The book club was set up, and we bought in loads of books and put a leaflet together of LGBT books and made them available to everyone. And then we also got Sebastian Barry to come in to the book club and talk about his book Days Without End, which was a really exciting event and great for the book club, because he was doing a tour of minority groups. I think he went to a hospital as well, and just a couple of other minority groups. But we got him to come to our book club, which was great. And what you were saying about LGBT representation in the media, I think it's so important, because, I mean, when I was growing up, there were no, male-male or female-female relationships at all on TV. It was just, a woman marries a man and that's it. And I remember seeing actually on Neighbours one time, there was a lesbian storyline, and I was delighted with it, and I was following it closely. But it was such a rarity, and that wasn't way back in the 80s or 90s. That was in 2002. And even then, in 2002, there were very few lesbian or gay or bisexual storylines on soap operas. So I think it's changed a bit now. I hope so anyway.
Yeah. I was looking at a documentary yesterday, and apparently 41% of people playing gay characters who've been nominated for awards, for Oscars, die before the end of the film. Seems to be an issue with representation of LGBT people in film, that we have to die at some point. Often beautifully, but we do have to die. I suppose, and just to say as well to anybody who's listening out there, that we have a chat room here as well. So if you do have any questions, we'll have a little bit of time at the end. So do feel free to ask any questions, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. But I suppose one of the things I've been thinking on, not surprisingly, given where I work in Kilmainham Jail, but we're in the middle of this decade of centenaries, and the thing about commemoration, I think, is it's not necessarily always very illuminating about the past, but commemorations can be very revealing about the society at the time that is commemorating. And a lot of the discussions have kind of centered around kind of Irish identity and what it means to be Irish, and what being Irish means in 2021. But I also feel that for queer people, it's a somewhat problematic issue as well. And I suppose that one of the things I keep coming back to is, obviously I'm very proud to live in an independent Ireland, and it's very important to me that I am a citizen and not a subject. But I also can't get away from the fact that if Ireland hadn't become an independent country, I would not have grown up in a country where homosexuality was illegal. If I was a woman, I think it's safe to say that my rights for much of the 20th century would have been better without independence. And I'm just wondering if you have any kind of reflections about how LGBTQIA plus people might be complicating the narrative of this decade of commemoration. So, Kate, I'm going to start with you. Hard question.
No, thanks. How we're complicating it. I mean, I think it's changing, but I think there has been maybe an ease, but a pattern of telling sort of one narrative in history. And I think definitely the decade of centenaries those general times in Irish history that we mark in the decade of centenaries have been guilty of that, in that they're telling one narrative. And as you said, it's representative of the society, you live in at the time. So I think the fact that Ireland has changed so much means the narratives we're telling now are changing. I don't think they've changed enough. I think there's, more queer stories to be told and to be found. And I think there's a lot of fun in that. I think there's also loads of other minority narratives to be told, people of colour, traveller history. There's so many others that still aren't getting the space or the time or the recognition. I think our community has come a long way, and I think we've also, as a community, become a lot more comfortable in telling our history in the last, say, 10 or so years, which is great. And I think marriage equality has a lot to do with that. So I think there's maybe also space for us to maybe assist other communities in telling their stories. I don't know, something to think about. But I think there's a lot of fun in disrupting existing historical narratives. I take great joy in it, I'm not going to lie. So I think there's a lot of fun to be had.
So Páraic, do you think we're a disruptive force in these commemorations?
Yeah, Kate's kind of come at it the exact way that I was going to. And, queer history by its nature is disruptive. And I think, where does queer Irish history sit in the broader narrative is kind of what you're asking, Brian. And I think, for one, it challenges the academy. And when I'm saying the academy, the decision makers, the historians that have written queer Irish history and have, created the well-rehearsed events that we now kind of are all so familiar with. And they're very important to our national imaginary. And that's fair enough. But what queer history is, it's intentionally disrupting. It's intentionally haunting as a spectre at the fringe of that well-rehearsed narrative, and is deliberately trying to crack it open and open it up to critique it, because we deliberately need to be disruptive to disrupt and to critique how we actually do these histories. And I think Kate touched on a really fascinating point there, in that we need to be aware of the intersectionalities of our identities, but also the intersectionalities of our histories. And our histories cannot necessarily be siloed into particular kinds of genres or particular kinds of periods, but that they're far much more complex, and that queer ideals and a queer way of doing this can actually open up history and queerness to these broader ideas and subjects. You know, I kind of referenced a while back that, you know, written records of our past rarely exist. And if they do, they've been censored or destroyed. And when we do queer history, there's no guarantee that all aspects of the queer experience is going to emerge through that historical exchange or through that historical research. It would be foolish to think so. So queer histories are always going to be fractured. We're always going to be wondering and footnoting our gaydar, kind of feeling that through the historical pages that are presented before us. And with that, I think queer history itself, and we kind of, as queer historians, queer archivists, queer curators that work in all of these different spaces, have to always acknowledge that queer history, and given that we're queers, you know, it's never going to be complete, and queer history never can be complete by its very nature. And I think that's really something that's crucial and important that we'll always need to remember, because I think the queer perspective affords us the opportunity to know that the history we write and the ways in which we curate it will always become disrupted by the next generation or a colleague or somebody else. And that's what makes us fabulous, and that's what makes what we do fabulous. And I think that's what makes queer history a disruptive force in our broader national imaginary of how we do queer, or how we do Irish history more broadly.
Yeah, because I suppose, I said, as I mentioned earlier, like for me, when I started working in this area, the thing that made me feel uncomfortable was, I suppose, particularly working in museums, we've traditionally said, well, we know everything. And we feel that we have to, even when we don't know everything, we have to project an image of knowing everything. And I think actually it's very healthy, and it's been very healthy for us to say, you know, here's what we find out, but we don't have an answer. I can't tell you if this, you know, these two female revolutionaries were very, very, very good friends, or whether they were in a same-sex relationship. And I think that's been very liberating in lots of other ways. I hadn't quite expected that it would affect how I approached, you know, kind of non-queer subjects. Deirdre, I kind of feel that you've slightly done this already, because you were talking that the exhibition that you put on about Stonewall came out of the discussion about kind of decade of centenary exhibitions in the library service down in Cork.
But I have a clear example actually of how queer history is kind of pushed out in a way. Roger Casement. So when he was put to death after, you know, he was hanged on a comma, as they say. He said himself, actually, he would be hanged on a comma. You know, they celebrated his life in De Valera, celebrated his life and, you know, in his funeral, but it was never mentioned that he was gay, and that wasn't talked about, and, you know, that was pushed under the carpet completely. And so I think that's a good example of, because, you know, his black diaries were found, and that was mostly the reason why he was put to death, to be honest, I believe. So that's one example. And it's very difficult still to believe that homosexuality was only decriminalised in 1993. But my sister lives in Switzerland, and same-sex marriage was actually only legalised there on Sunday, would you believe?
Yeah.
So we're way ahead of Switzerland, which is quite surprising.
Yeah. But Switzerland didn't give women the vote until the 1970s. I sometimes think we think Switzerland is a bit more liberal than it is.
We do,
but you're so right about case. The thing I find fascinating by Casement is he's also really interesting in terms of revealing attitudes towards homosexuality in kind of Irish life. In some ways, the Casement controversy around the authenticity has created a space to where homosexuality was discussed. But often, I think often that space was a space where kind of queerness and gayness was kind of discussed in a very negative way, which brings me on to one of our audience questions, which kind of touches on this issue. So the question is, do you think that representation helps society to understand and create understanding, or brings out attitudes that already exist? I suppose negative attitudes. And I suppose that's getting back to the thing we were saying in relation to social media. So I suppose, is representation always a good thing? Is it always worth having, even though it can bring out these negative reactions? Kate, do you have any thought on?
Yeah, I think, I'm an eternal optimist. I'm aware of that. So generally, if you haven't guessed already, a lot of my tone will be, no, it'll be okay. I do also think, though, that a lot of the negativity, particularly when it comes to social media, or sometimes even the media more broadly, can often be a smaller group than we think. They just happen to be really loud. Which, not always, I'm well aware of that, and that is maybe a bit of a generalization, but just to briefly take it back to the exhibition we have up at the moment, part of what the group of young people wanted to do was have a survey of the visitors that came in, because a huge message that they had was educating the public as they came in. They were well aware, and we made them aware, that obviously the gallery's audience are so very broad and might know nothing about the community. So they wanted to do a survey to kind of gauge that and see if they were doing the educating that they wanted to. And I've had the great joy of inputting all the data from those handwritten surveys. But it's been amazing how many people have said either yes, they knew something about the community already, but yes, they left knowing more, or no, they knew nothing about the community, and yes, they've left knowing more. So I think while the exhibition downstairs has gotten very little to almost no backlash. But I think even though there is a risk involved in that representation, and a risk involved in those artists putting their name out there, as there is for any LGBT person putting their name forward for anything, a lot of the time, I think there's still such value in doing that, in the representation of it, and in them sticking their neck out, I guess, for the rest of the community, in the hopes that the little nuggets throughout the world and throughout social media or culture and media in general, all adds up to enough honest to goodness education that does the world some good. But again, as I said, I'm an eternal optimist, so you guys might have other opinions.
Páraic, I suppose this is kind of very much kind of the area that you have been kind of looking at, is the representation, but also the backlash that might have resulted in that. So Father Bernard Lynch is on the Late Late Show discussing homosexuality, but you're also aware that in houses around the country at that time in the 1980s, there was going to be a lot of negative reaction to what he was talking about in relation to working with gay people and people suffering from AIDS. So I suppose I don't suppose it's a yes or no answer, is it?
I think it can be a yes or no answer, and it can be a bit of both. I think it does feed into what Kate's saying in regards to being a very loud minority. And kind of, if I'm going to kind of pluck in a thread of kind of what I've researched from my book, it would be the case of what I refer to as the curious case of the lesbian nuns, Rosemary Kerr and Nancy Manahan, who were on the Late Late Show back in 1984. And that got the rapture of middle Catholic Ireland, who in their, hundreds, and I don't think it went above 100, protested the fact that they were staying in the Buswells Hotel, to the extent that the hotel manager of Buswells Hotel had to throw them out. Then they erected an ice cream van with a statue of the Virgin Mary on top of a ice cream van outside of RTE Studios, as they were led through decades of rosary by a priest. And this caused a big brouhaha in the media that was going on for the whole week. That generated, I think, the Late Late Show's biggest rated episode of the whole 1980s, all because two lesbian nuns were going to appear on the Late Late Show, actually having a very deep philosophical discussion about fate, spirituality, and sexuality. So it was actually quite a complex issue they were going on to talk about. and ended up not being all that sensationalistic. And what people actually found was that they were kind of going to themselves, oh, is that what a lesbian nun looks like? Is that what they're like? Well, that's not exciting. They're not living in some sort of perpetual orgy. This is boring, and they're just like me. And there was this kind of moment where the actual hysteria that generated around it, the Streisand effect that emerged, ended up with people kind of responding to it going, oh, okay, so they're just normal people and these right-wing Catholics are just crazy. So that was kind of what emerged from that. So sometimes from the negativity, you see a really extreme behavior and a really extreme opinion that actually alienates mostly people who are in the middle of the political spectrum. And often they kind of go to themselves, well, if they're behaving like that and that's what they're like, then I think I would rather be on the side with the lesbians and go for a drink with them. So that's kind of what emerged from that. So I think it is a bit of both to answer the question, Brian.
Yeah. Because I was thinking as well of like issues around the representations of trans characters in the Crying Game. And again, I was kind of looking at a documentary about that, and transgender people saying that how hurtful aspects of the film were for them, but also how important the film was as a representation of a trans life. That I suppose to that acknowledgement that you exist. Deirdre, what do you think? In terms of, I suppose representation is important, but it can bring out a lot of kind of negativity. How were your exhibitions received in the libraries? Because I often feel that libraries are a very democratic space, but a democratic space can also be a space in which people feel free to express unpleasant views.
No, I actually didn't have any negative views. It was received very well, and in fact, Link, which I mentioned earlier, also got the exhibition for a week part of a week during Pride, and also the brother organisation for gay men, Cork Gay Project, as well, got it for the other half of the week. And also UCC actually contacted me and asked me if they could display it as well for a month. So it was actually really well received, and I didn't get any negative feedback. But I think representation is so important, and even though it is risky and could even be a little bit dangerous, but I still think it's necessary. On Sunday, I actually saw a film at the Indie Film Festival here in Cork about the Key Co-op, which was the kind of the centre of political activism in the 1980s, and it did a lot for the gay rights movement. And Arthur Leahy set up the Key Co-op. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he and his partner at the time, Laurie Steele, were actually on TV as well in the early 80s talking about being gay. And I'm just astounded by him, and just so I admire them so much, because it must have been so dangerous for them. I mean, they were so brave to do that, to go on television talking about being gay in the early 80s when it was illegal, and it was, Catholic Ireland, and, they could have been beaten up on the street, or, and they still did it. And because of people like them and David Norris, who, represented the community at a time when it wasn't safe to do so, if it wasn't for people like that, then I don't know where we'd be today.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important, even though it is risky.
I think sometimes we can be too careful sometimes, and a bit of bravery is important. And also, I think the thing that constantly surprises me is just how much queer representation in places like libraries and on the media and in places like the National Gallery and Kilmainham Jail, how much that means to people, and just how powerful that can be. And I suppose the positivity that brings about is worth any amount of hassle from the fringes of the fringes of social media and other dark places. So on that very positive note of bravery, and to pick up on something Páraic said as well, just be a bit of fabulousness as well. It's really the thing that we can bring to the party. I think we'll wrap up things for the evening. So it just remains for me to thank Kate, thank Deirdre, to thank Páraic, and also to thank our hosts in the National Library, and thank Breed in particular, who's done great work in organising this, and to thank, of course, Tonie Walsh, who came up with the idea of doing tonight's discussion. And I'm really looking forward to meeting you all in person, where we will all be on the same timeline and nobody will be frozen out. So anyway, take care, and hopefully we'll see you all soon. Thank you.